So it's time to decide, do you use artillery or not? Well, what I did want to tell you very quickly is that the biggest killer in World War I was not poisonous gas. It was not machine guns, though both of those were very potent and powerful weapons. And it wasn't that new weapon, the tank. It was actually cannon. It was artillery. These things could fire, the biggest ones could fire a shell weighing as much as a small car, about 22 miles. Um, so most artillery, of course, was much smaller than that, especially near the front line because, if it was massive, you had to move it by like railroads and you wanted to be able to move it where there were no roads. So most of the artillery tended to be smaller. The artillery was killing so many people that in order to try and limit the number of casualties, they started creating helmets. All right, so this is where the Army helmet comes from. The first Army helmet was actually of a French design, and it came out in 1915. And the story behind it is pretty simple. And I'll show you, this one happens to actually be an American World War I helmet here. The story behind it has come down is that the French, seeing the number of people who were dying in the war, sent doctors to the hospitals to try and figure out how to save their soldiers' lives. And one of these doctors met a French soldier who had worn his mess bowl, a bowl under his hat. The French were using kepes. This one's not a World War I one, but it's this sort of style of hat. And the bowl fit under it. And what had happened was a shell had landed fairly close by, but it had thrown up rock and sent up wood splinters. And one of these rocks or chunks of earth had come down and landed on his head and had actually broke the bowl and had cracked his skull, but clearly the mess bowl had saved him. So the doctor began to realize that a lot of guys weren't dying from the direct effect of the shell. They're dying from, pieces of rock and pieces of masonry and debris that's being thrown up by the shell. And so he began to look for an answer. And they came across the firemen. And the French firemen had helmets like fairly similar to this. It's called an Adrian helmet. And so this is what they began to make in fairly large numbers. Immediately, the Germans and the British also began making helmets. And when the U.S. entered the war, we chose what's called a Brodie design, which is basically the British design. And that's where Army helmets came from. They didn't stop bullets. They weren't supposed to. Modern helmets are made out of a sort of anti-ballistic nylon material, and these will stop a bullet in the right circumstances. I mean, I wouldn't volunteer to try, but it has happened. So, are you going to use artillery? It's the big killer. The problem with it is if you use artillery, then they know where you're going to attack. So that's the give-off. That's the trade-off. All right, good luck.